Section 5 of Tribal Custom in Anglo-Saxon Law by Frederic Seebohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, The Summary of Cymric Evidence, Part 3. The amount of the Cymric galanas. In all the Welsh codes, the galanas, as already mentioned, is described in a peculiar form. It is a combination of two items, that is, the sarad, or payment for insult, and the galanas proper. Thus the galanas of the innate boneddig, or young tribesman, accepted by the kindred as a tribesman of 9 descents of Cymric blood, is described as 3 kine and 60 kine. That of the uchelwr, or breer, as 6 kine and 60 kine. The explanation of this is obtained from the following passage. Quote, "What is the galanas of the breer without office? 6 kine and 60 kine. The 60 kine is the galanas, and the 6 kine is for sarad of the corpse." End quote. So also in the Gwentian Code. Quote, "When a married man shall be murdered, his sarad is first paid, and then his galanas, for the wife has the third of the sarad, and she has no part of the galanas." End quote. So also in the Venedosian Code. Quote, "No one is killed without being first subjected to sarad. If a man be married, let a third of the man's sarad be given to his wife, and let the 2 shares be placed with the galanas, and after that let the galanas be divided into 3 shares, and let the 3rd share go to the lord as exacting third." End quote. The reason why the wife has a share in the sarad, and not in the galanas, has already been explained. She suffers from the personal affront or insult to her slain husband, and shares in the sarad. But she has no blood relationship with her husband, and only the husband's kindred are therefore entitled to share in the galanas, as her husband's kindred alone would have been concerned in the feud. The sarad and the galanas were therefore separate things and subject to separate rules, though both payable on the murder of a tribesman. The galanas proper is what must be regarded in any comparison with continental wergelds. The real galanas of the uchelwr, or breer, apart from the sarad, was 120 cows, and that of the young innate boneddig, who had received his dar but had no family, was 60 cows. In one of the codes, his galanas, when married, is said to be 80 cows. Now, in what currency was the galanas paid? Formerly, according to the codes, all payments were made in cattle, and the galanas proper was reckoned in scores of cows. But of what cow? How was the normal cow for practical purposes to be defined? It is a question worth answering, because we may probably take the Cymric method of valuing the cow as a unit of currency in cattle, as at any rate suggestive of the methods generally adopted by other tribes. According to the Venedosian Code, the cow was of full normal value when in full milk and until her 5th calf. Quote, "And if there be any dispute concerning her milk, she is to be taken on the 9th day of May to a luxuriant place, wherein no animal has been before her, and the owner is to milk her without leaving any for the calf, and put the milk in the measure vessel, and if it be full twice a day, that is sufficient. And if it be not, the deficiency is to be compensated by oatmeal until the feast of St. Curic, thence until the feast of St. Michael by barley meal, and from thence until the calendar of winter by rye meal." Others say that the worth of the milk deficient in the measure is to be returned to the possessor of the cow. If half the milk be deficient, half the worth. If a third of the milk, a third of the worth, and that is the best mode. End quote. Then the milk measure is described thus. Quote, "The measure for her milk is 3 thumbs at the bottom, 6 in the middle of the vessel, and 9 at the top, and 9 in its height diagonally, or enihid en amrescoiu, and the thumb whereby the vessel is to be measured, in case of dispute, is the breadth of the judge's thumb." End quote. In the Diocletian Code, substantially the same rules are given, except that the measure of the cow's milking is smaller. Quote, "The measure of a vessel for a cow's milk is 9 thumbs at its edge, and 3 at the bottom, and 7 diagonally from the offside groove to the nearside edge in height." End quote. The only difference is between the 7 and the 9 thumbs of diagonal measurement. Possibly there may be some error in the figures, and the measure may have been the same in both codes. Returning to the gallinace, although it was reckoned in the codes in scores of cows, a fixed equation had already been made between cows and silver. The normal cow was equated in the codes with 3 scores of silver, and in the Latin version of the Diocletian Code, the score of silver is translated by uncia argenti. The score of silver at the date of the code was therefore an ounce of silver, so that the reckoning is the Frankish or Anglo-Saxon one of 20 pence to the ounce. The score of pence of 32 wheat grains would make the ounce of 640 wheat grains, that is, the ounce of the pound of 240 pence, or 7,680 wheat grains. The pound in use in England after the time of Kings Offa and Alfred, and at the date of the codes. The gallinace of the uchelor or breir being 120 cows, and the cow being reckoned at 3 scores or ounces of silver, the gallinace would equal 360 scores or ounces, or 30 pounds of silver. The ratio of gold to silver after the temporary disturbance under Charlemagne had, as we have seen, settled down again to the imperial ratio of 1 to 12. Now 30 pounds of 7,680 wheat grains equal 230,400 wheat grains, and this number of silver wheat grains divided by 12 equaled exactly 19,200 wheat grains of gold. So that this Celtic gallinace of the Cymric uchelor or breir of 120 cows, like so many continental wergelds, was apparently exactly equal to 200 gold solidi of 96 wheat grains, i.e. the heavy gold minor of imperial standard. The methods of treatment of strangers or non-tribesmen. Another point upon which special inquiry is made in this volume regards tribal methods of treating strangers in blood and slaves. There is no subject requiring more careful investigation than the combination of circumstances out of which arose what is roughly called serfdom, i.e. the attachment of tenants to the land rendering services to a lord. I shall not be suspected of suggesting that tribal customs and methods were the sole factors which produced serfdom, and of ignoring the influences which came from Roman methods of managing landed estates, and from Roman law modified by ecclesiastical usage. Indeed, I have insisted from the first that while in the Germania of Tacitus the germs may be found of an embryo manor, both Roman and German elements probably combined in producing the later manorial system and serfdom which grew up in what were once the Roman provinces of Gaul and the 2 Germanies, and even also in Britain. But I think that in Cymric tribal custom we may find a fresh clue worth following in the attempt to gather from continental evidence the methods likely to be used by conquering German or Anglo-Saxon tribes in the treatment of strangers in blood. In Welsh tribal custom, ashtids, or strangers and their descendants, not necessarily otherwise unfree persons, having some special circumstances in their favour, being allowed to settle within the district of a greater or lesser chieftain upon land, which in a sense may have been his demesne land, were free to remove and settle under another chieftain, unless and until they had remained on the same land or under the same lordship for 4 generations. But thereafter the great-grandchildren of the original settlers became adscripti glebae, and this fixture to the land, or rather to the lordship, was apparently not looked upon as in any way a degradation in rank, but on the contrary a step in advance towards the recognition of tribal rights. The great-grandson of the stranger did not indeed become a Cymric tribesman, but he gained the recognition of his status as the founder of a kindred of his own, the members of which, in after generations, would as kinsmen be able to swear for and defend one another. This being so in the case of free strangers coming into the country, the next question is what was the position of the semi-servile class, the aelts and the teogs of the codes, who and whose ancestors for many generations had been born upon the land in a semi-servile condition. The fixture to the land of the aelt or teog was not the special mark so much of a semi-servile condition as of his want of recognised kindred, and under the local custom of South Wales it seems that he too, like the aeltid, could sometimes arrive at the recognition of kindred, without indeed becoming a Cymric tribesman, at the end of 4 generations of residence under the chieftain of the land, and even to further recognition of it involving a still better position as to rights at the 9th generation. The 9th man in South Wales seems, according to local custom in some districts, to have at last climbed the highest rung of the ladder, and to have attained the right to claim the status of a Cymric tribesman. This curious rise under Cymric custom, by steps of 4 generations, up the ladder towards the recognition of tribal rights, seems to have a suggestive correspondence with the reverse process under manorial usage of proving the serfdom of a nativus, by showing that the great-grandfather was a nativus on the lord's land, the manorial rule being that settlement on servile land for 4 generations made the posterity of an original settler into nativi. Once more, let us try to realize what this meant, and what was the position of these Cymric non-tribesmen in regard to their settlement on land. If under the guidance of the codes we turn to the extents and surveys, we find them living in some cases not mixed up with the tribesmen, but in separate groups, or trevs, or trevgorths. There may be here and there exceptional athlids or strangers of a higher class, growing up by the gradual process of intermarriage for 4 generations with tribeswomen into the status of tribesmen. But the mass of the stranger class were aelts and teogs, living in separate teog trevs, though according to the surveys sharing often in common certain rights of grazing over certain districts with gwellies of tribesmen. Now these group of teogs and aelts were, according to the codes, as we have seen, of 2 classes, and we recognize the same 2 classes when we find in the surveys not only groups of teogs in teog trevs, but also gwellies of non-tribesmen. The normal group of the teog trev differed from the free trev in the fact that in it no family rights were recognized. All the members of it shared in its rights and payments equally per capita, and not per stirpes. They were all liable as a body, few or many, for the whole amount of the dues to the chieftains. During their father's lifetime, sons shared pari passu, and equally with their parents, and other members of the group, in the pasture and common ploughing, except youngest sons, who remained with their fathers. In the gwellies, on the other hand, as in the gwellies of tribesmen, there was recognition of family or blood relationships, and a patriarchal element. There were thus, under Cymric tribal custom, various subordinate grades or classes. Beginning at the bottom of the ladder were 1. The slaves who could be bought and sold, and who were reckoned as worth £1 of silver. 2. The teogs and aelts, or permanent nativi, born non-tribesmen without recognized family rights. 3. Non-tribesmen growing or having grown in 4 generations into gwellies of non-tribesmen with recognized family rights. And 4. Strangers of exceptional position, who, having married into the tribe, had become tribesmen in the 4th generation by repeated intermarriage. And once more the fact should never be lost sight of, that the gradual growth into tribal or quasi-tribal rights was not a growth into exactly what in a modern sense would be called individual freedom. It was accompanied by the growth of ties which bound the family to the chieftain, till at the moment that at the 4th generation the recognition of rights of kindred was attained, the family found itself, as we have seen, so closely tied to the chieftain and the land, that the newly recognized gwelli had become adscriptus glebae. Finally, the tribal logic of the case was probably something like this. The free tribesman is the man who belongs to a kindred who can protect him by oath and by sword. Until a stranger has kinsmen who can do this, he is an odd or kinless man, protected only by his lord. If he be killed, his galanas goes to his lord. He has no recognized kin to receive it. If, on the other hand, he is charged with slaying another, he has no kin to swear to his innocence, the oath of a non-tribesman not being held good as against a tribesman. If guilty, he has no kin bound to fight in the feud for him, or to help him to pay a galanas for his crime. So that even when at the 4th generation the descendant of the Ashtid becomes the founder of a Gweli, he has gained only half the status of a tribesman. It is not till the 4th generation of descendants in the Gweli, i.e. the 7th generation from the original settler, that a complete kindred has grown up. It is not till then that the descendant of the original Ashtid is surrounded by a full group of relatives, born in his great-grandfather's Gweli, whose oaths can be taken and who can protect him by oath and sword or in payment of galanas. All this time, the Ashtid family have been more or less dependent on the protection of the chieftain, and rights and obligations are apt to be correlative. The object of this essay is to inquire how far, in the case of other tribes, evidence may be found of the working of somewhat similar tribal instincts, resulting in customary rules more or less like those of the Cymry, so that, at last, turning attention to the Anglo-Saxon laws, we may be able all the more fully to recognize and appreciate in them the traits of tribal custom, which among other factors went to the making of Anglo-Saxon England. In the meantime, for future reference, the following list of the galanas of various classes will be found convenient. The chief of kindred, 180 cows. In Gwent and Dymecia, 540, and his family 180. The uchelwr, 120 cows. Man with family without office, 80 cows. The innate boneddig, unmarried, 60 cows. The Ashtid of the Brenhin or chief, 60 cows. The Ashtid of uchelwrs, 30 cows. Bondman, 1 pound of silver, or 4 cows. Bondman from beyond sea, 6 cows. End of section 5. End of chapter 2.